The negativity in the Final Fantasy XIV space is inescapable. It's everywhere. I've seen it in my own comments, I've seen it elsewhere online. There's a lot of people unhappy with the current state of the game, and this is a massive departure for a game that for the longest time was known for how positive everything and everyone was about it. As 7.3 approaches, I think the negativity surrounding Final Fantasy XIV and Dawntrail has only grown. So let's talk about it, how we got here, and where we go from here. Hello everyone, I am Jmulls, and let's get into it. Now, today's story doesn't begin in Dawntrail. I believe it begins back in Endwalker. 6.0 saw the conclusion of the Hydaelyn and Zodiac arc, and while not everyone was pleased by how it all wrapped up, personally speaking, I was absolutely in love with what they did, with what they told for that finale. I loved largely every part of that, and it's some of my favorite moments in all of Final Fantasy XIV. It was a conclusion to a story that will always be precious to me, and I was excited to see where this story and this world and this game would go from here. And then we got to the patches of Endwalker. We explored more of Radzad Han. We discovered a way to the 13th, the Void. We met up with Zero, and we had an entire storyline heavily based on things from Final Fantasy IV throughout the remaining patches of Endwalker. And I think it's here that we see the beginning of the shift in perspective for Final Fantasy XIV, where it goes from a game that could do no wrong to a game that seemingly, according to a lot of people out there, largely only does wrong. It's a massive about-face. And I don't think the story is as simple as, oh, they went from doing only good things to only doing bad things. There's still quite a few things that they still do to this day that I think are good and additive to the overall experience. But I think what began with Endwalker, and specifically the patches in Endwalker, was something that would really be the final straw that broke the camel's back when we got to Dawntrail. But throughout Endwalker, it was still riding on the high of that Hydaelyn and Zodiac arc. But the patches to Endwalker in a lot of ways were lacking in really sticky content. The relic system was largely seen as a slog, requiring the completion of a side story quest chain with Hildebrand that a lot of people out there just simply didn't want to do because the humor there is polarizing. It lands for me, and I love Hildebrand. I didn't mind being incentivized to do something that I already really liked, but I don't think that was the smart play for the overall health of the game. Hildebrand shines when it's completely optional, and the people that want that story, that want that type of comedy, are able to go and seek it out. Whereas in Endwalker, people felt as if they had to consume that even if they didn't want to because they wanted the relic weapon. And yeah, you don't need the relic weapon, but it's supposed to be a cool chase to get a really cool and unique weapon for your job and for the other jobs that you want. It's supposed to be a really cool piece of kit. But I think the cracks that form, or at least are shown in Endwalker, are not limited to just the relic weapon. They're just a symptom of a larger and overall problem that is becoming more and more apparent as the patches go on from this point on. Outside of raiding, Final Fantasy XIV was largely lacking in interesting things to do. Island sanctuaries were supposed to be this large new addition, the thing people have been wanting for so long, even if they didn't know they actively wanted it. An entire island to cultivate and to really make their own. And while the developers tried their best to rein in expectations, the premise of the system was a runaway freight train of hype and expectations. And when it launched and was delivered to people, sure, there were some people that quite liked what they did with it, but there's a lot of people out there that became quickly disillusioned with the content that island sanctuaries were. They were largely just a boring grind. Not only were they a boring grind, they were a boring grind on top of a click this button to build something and then wait a while for it to be built to go grind some more. The interesting gameplay, the relaxing content loop that people were expecting and wanting out of a system like this, for a lot of people just didn't land. And you can tell a bunch of people that it's not going to be a specific thing. It's not going to be Stardew Valley. It's not going to be Animal Crossing. You can tell people it's not going to be like that. But if that's what they actually wanted out of that system, simply telling them it's not going to be what they want is not going to make it something that is more palatable relatable to them. Again, island sanctuaries weren't the only problem here, they were merely showcasing to a lot of people the deeper issues that were starting to form. The cracks were starting to widen and lengthen. Let's talk about the story. Rather polarizing and controversial with the character of Zero and the story they told. I didn't mind it so much. I actually quite liked the character of Zero. However, the reactions were readily apparent out there. A lot of people were just less interested. I wouldn't say they hated it, but they were just less interested in what was being told there compared to, well, the stories they've been told for the last couple of expansions. And we'll revisit that idea again when we get to Dawntrail, but I think for a lot of people it became really apparent that this game's foundation was its story. A lot of people knew that already, but it was becoming extremely apparent for a lot of people just how reliant everything in this game was on its story. And if that story and the intrigue people had with it started to crumble and fade, a lot of other things fell right alongside it. The other endgame content that Endwalker brought to the table was cool for a little bit, but largely was forgotten and just cast aside quickly. The deep dungeon, variant dungeons. They tried their best to introduce a bunch of variant dungeons throughout Endwalker, and while they were a really cool idea, people just didn't feel incentivized to go out and do that content. I wouldn't call Endwalker a bad expansion by any stretch of the imagination, and I quite liked the individual pieces of content more than probably the average player, even if I didn't do much of the deep dungeon itself. I think variant dungeons are a really cool idea that I would love to see expanded and iterated on in the future. I quite enjoyed the story with Zero. I thought that character was really interesting, and I liked everything they did with the 13th. I was engaged with that narrative. I was looking forward to the next installment every step of the way. Sure, did it feel a little bit dragged out because we were so accustomed to stories being told in patches from like a 0.0 to a 0.3, and then 0.4 and 5 will lean into the next expansion, and that just wasn't the case with Endwalker? Yeah, sure. But still, overall, I enjoyed what they did there. But I did find myself engaging with the endgame in Endwalker way less than I had with an expansion like Shadowbringers, because the content that was there didn't particularly appeal to me, and there was no endgame system that I felt like I just wanted to dump a bunch of hours into. And I think going into Dawntrail, people were ready for a fresh start. And while I wouldn't call the critiques that people had of Endwalker game-breaking or ruining or anything like that, I think those problems only became exaggerated and focused in on when we got to the next expansion, Dawntrail. Speaking of, the reason I started this video off with a discussion on Endwalker was because the problems that we are currently seeing with Dawntrail and the reception of Dawntrail overall didn't start with 7.0. I think you can find and trace a lot of this sentiment back to those Endwalker days. But it's just the problems that people had with Endwalker were just taken up to 11 with Dawntrail, because in a lot of ways, it was more of the same exact root issues, even if they were just packaged in different ways. We don't need to sit here and spend 15 hours or so talking about why people didn't like the story of Dawntrail. There are quite a few people out there that do, but a lot of people, and the common sentiment that I tend to say is that people were really not receptive to the story told with Dawntrail. And when it comes to 0.0 and 0.1, I tend to agree. I liked the parts with Alexandria somewhat. I still had my issues with them, but I think there was some saving graces there. I always liked the character of Sphene, even if some people didn't. And while I believe the story got way better with 7.2, that's simply not enough for a lot of people that were disillusioned with what they experienced from 7.0 and 7.1. Like we talked about before, the story is where most of the investment comes from for a lot of people for Final Fantasy XIV. And when people become disillusioned with the story that was told, it falls upon the gameplay to act as a safety net to catch all those people that were falling off because of the story execution. But if you weren't into high-end rating, well, until we got things like Cosmic Exploration and things like the Occult Crescent, you just didn't have all that much that was fresh and new. It just felt like retreading on things that we had seen before in Final Fantasy XIV, because as I've always talked about, for better or for worse, Final Fantasy XIV is predictable and reliable in terms of what you are going to get out of it. People were enjoying job design less than in years prior, the content itself felt somewhat stagnant and stale, and when we finally got new stuff, for a lot of people, it did just feel like retreading on ground we have already walked. Cosmic Exploration in a lot of ways was just another version of Ishgard Restoration, and the Occult Crescent just another version of Eureka and Bosja. And for quite a few people, lesser versions of those pieces of content. That same formula that people had become accustomed to, and at one point in time liked, was becoming stale, repetitive, and lost the luster that it once had. And the content that was available in the game largely just felt overly grindy, with mechanics and gameplay involved in that grind that just wasn't particularly engaging or endearing to do. Whether the grind is long or short, people aren't going to want to do it if they don't feel incentivized to do the grind, and if the grind itself is really boring. It doesn't matter if the grind can be done rather quickly or take a long time if people just simply don't want to do it. And when the game tried to do fresh and new and interesting things mechanically, sometimes it stuck the landing. I thought the interesting 1v1 combat scenarios in the main story quests were rather cool, and I would love to see more of them in the future, and possibly even make them replayable somehow. That could be really awesome. But then the game does things that on the surface are supposed to be really dang cool, right? Let's take Cosmic Exploration. You get to control a giant robot. That's awesome. Who doesn't like a good giant robot? And in actuality, the functionality of that system is just, yeah, it looks cool, but the mechanics of it boil down to just another version of the same grind you're already doing. Instead of burning down small little bushes, you get to burn down slightly larger bushes. And maybe you can charge up one laser beam you can aim. Oh, you're fighting this giant beast in the main story quest. How cool will this hunt be? Oh, it's largely just a sack of health and you dodge an AoE every like 20 seconds or so. I don't think phantom jobs in Occult Crescent are as cut and dry, but I think it's fair to say that quite a few of those phantom jobs just feel kind of bland and not particularly exciting to play. I think even one of the better ones with Cannoneer, right? Just summoning freaking Napoleon Bonaparte-esque cannons to fire at your opponent, that should be really dang cool, but it kind of gets lost, as the main standout feature of that is the visual of it. But when you're in those giant fights with a bunch of people and all those effects are going off, it's hard to really make out your character summoning that little cannon and the chaos of it all. Still cool when you see it, right? Don't get me wrong. But I think my favorite example of this is the Chemist Phantom job, where it's like the abilities you get are pretty powerful in terms of what they do, but in terms of the class fantasy, it just feels so lackluster, where your main mechanic is just go buy a bunch of potions from the vendor and use them. A lot of the time, I feel that Square Enix plays it far too safe mechanically, instead of really asking themselves, how can they make this functionality be really cool, be really memorable and engaging? Heck, I've been playing another Square Enix game called Bravely Default. That game also has a job system, and while it's not an MMORPG, obviously, it does have a salve maker, which is that game's version of Chemist. And the mechanic is, you can combine various items for different effects. And when you defeat various monsters, you can use those monster parts as part of your alchemical concoctions that you can utilize to either buff, sustain, or protect your own party members, or damage or do anything to the enemy. That could have been a really cool system, especially in a zone that is supposed to have a bunch of unique enemies to fight. Especially if you made those items tradable between players. How many more people would feel incentivized to go gold farming, where even if they didn't want the rewards that gold coins provided, they could get those like Phantom Chemist reagents, and if they didn't use them themselves, they could trade them to other players they knew that ran that job, or trade them to players that needed them, or sell them on the market board or something. I think it could have been really cool if we had more design in a piece of content like the Occult Crescent, which is meant to be segmented away from the rest of the game, to lean more in that direction and to go wild and wacky and have fun with it. Lean into the idea of the fantasy instead of it being the safest possible iteration humanly possible. Then you have the whole mess with the Fork Tower and all that, and how they had to address community feedback about it. And I know Yoshi P brought up the idea of cost in that letter from the producer live as to why the Fork Tower that we have doesn't also have a normal and savage mode instead of just having one difficulty. It's also important to clarify we don't know necessarily what he meant by cost. Do they just need more people? Do they just need more time overall? Is it a cost like that? Is it some combination of all those elements? From my perspective at least, we know Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most important elements to the success of Square Enix as a business. You would hope something like cost would never be really brought up when it comes to important and really, at the end of the day, basic elements of this design. I think a lot of what we're seeing from Dawntrail is a combination of people that were unsatisfied with the story told in 7.0 and 0.1 that still need to be won back in that regard, but also finding themselves disappointed with the content output the game has been doing, where things either feel way too repetitive or they don't live up to what they should be in terms of how cool these elements could be mechanically, but just aren't because they play it way too safe. And whether they play it safe because they are afraid to really flesh these systems out and to make them mechanically interesting to the way that I talked about before, or they just simply don't have the time or the resources to dedicate to these systems to really fully flesh them out past what we already have. The end result is the same. And there's another element to all of this that we need to talk about. Final Fantasy XIV isn't in a vacuum. There's a lot of competition, especially in the year 2025, for people's attention, whether that be other MMORPGs like World of Warcraft and Guild Wars 2 among many others, other live service games, other gacha games. If people want a world that will constantly evolve and grow over time, with a story that is told over time as well, where they have reasons to log on and play every day and have something to chase, there are a lot of games nowadays that provide that framework. And a lot of those games don't have a cost for every expansion on top of a sub-cost on top of an online store. Competition is right. It's out there. There's a lot of it. And there's so many different ways that not only social media, not only other games, but pretty much everything is vying for people's attention. So to convince someone to set aside a lot of time and the money that is required to play a game like Final Fantasy XIV, you need to be able to convince those people to dedicate that time and money away from what they could be playing. Instead, everything else, and choose to dedicate that time and money to you. That investment, that emotional investment to you. That is a tough sell, and for a lot of people, if they grew up playing games like these, or they have been playing for years, there is something known as the sunk cost fallacy, where they feel as if they're too deep to get out now. But if the game continues to go in a direction to where people just go, this isn't for me anymore, I'm more upset than I am happy and content with what I'm experiencing, they'll just continue to leave over time. People play video games because at the end of the day, they want to be engaged with the product. They want to be invested in the world, they want to be invested in the characters, they want to be invested in the gameplay they're experiencing. They want something to excite them, they want something to where they can feel they can relax and set aside everything else and lose themselves in the world that you craft, in the world you provide as an escape for them. That is one of the most wonderful elements of an MMORPG. But if the game no longer feels like an escape and it feels like a to-do list, it feels like a chore to log on and do the same repetitive tasks that are not interesting, not engaging over and over and over again, even if the quote-unquote grind isn't as long as what a lot of MMORPGs used to do, the industry is catching up, and there is no perfect game out there without any faults or issues. But there's a lot of variety and options out there nowadays, and people's attention can easily move somewhere else if for a long enough period of time you fail to make people feel rewarded for the time and money they invest in your game. Okay, so where do we go from here? Let's talk about the future, people. What about patch 7.3? What about patch 7.4? What about patch 7.5? Well, honestly, yeah, there's a part of me that wants to see some philosophical direction shifts take place in the remainder of these patches. I just don't see them going for the large swath changes in game design philosophy that I think this game needs in the patches of Dawntrail. I think we'll see some of the feedback taken into account. I think future Phantom jobs for Occult Crescent will be way cooler, hopefully. We'll see tweaks and twists for the future zones of, say, Cosmic Exploration for the final zone of the Occult Crescent. We'll see that normal and savage version for the next raid we get in the Occult Crescent. Hopefully and ideally, the story will continue the pace and the quality that 7.2 provided. 7.3 is shaping to be a massive patch in this regard because it's the finale of the Dawntrail story. They're not doing what they did with Endwalker, where all the patches were just one self-contained narrative. 7.3 is back to the days of the 0.3 patch being the finale. This not only closes the book on the story that is arguably the most divisive in all of Final Fantasy XIV, but it can possibly lay the groundwork for where this story goes immediately in the future. This is a pivotal time for the story of Final Fantasy XIV, and I have faith in them in this. I do. Like I said before, and I repeat ad nauseum, I really like the story in 7.2. I love the character of Sphene. She's one of my favorites. I think Calyx, while not the most interesting villain in the known universe or anything like that, I think he's rather decent compared to what we've had for the last good while here. There's a lot of potential when it comes to the narrative that is told in 7.3. And where they can further shine is in the lead up to 8.0 with 7.4 and 7.5. Have those patches really move the tone, the aesthetic of Final Fantasy XIV away from what Dawntrail provided and more towards whatever 8.0 is shaping up to be. Get people excited for the story that will be really told in 8.0. And if they continue the quality of the story that was told in 7.2, or even tell the story better from here on out, I think we'll see more and more people warm themselves up to the current story of Final Fantasy XIV, compared to where we were in 7.0 and 0.1. And in that regard, I am really optimistic in Final Fantasy XIV's future. I have seen MMORPGs have massive missteps from one expansion, and then course correct and do a lot better in the next expansion. We have even seen that in Final Fantasy XIV. Like, just think back to Stormblood. 0.0 in Stormblood was rather divisive. I liked it. A lot of people didn't like the characters of, like, Lys and Xenos. But then a lot of people absolutely adore the patches of Stormblood. And I don't see why Dawntrail can't also have that same effect. When it comes to the actual gameplay loop, I think it'll largely be more of the same. And in that regard, I think we will continue to see a lot of negativity for Final Fantasy XIV. But while I think the story, so long as they carry the momentum of 7.2 forward, will be largely fine, if not really dang good, I don't see sentiment about the overall game state really shifting with 7.3. It looks like another Dawntrail patch, right? But we get a deep dungeon this time. And deep dungeons haven't really moved the needle for many people in the past, at least from my experience. Maybe they can knock it out of the park with this deep dungeon. Maybe they have something cooking. They do have that optional harder fight at the very end. We'll have to wait and see. I don't think that one fight is going to really move the needle for many people, but like I said, I think 7.3 will largely go down as the story could be really dang cool, but the content of the patch is just another Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail patch. I think 7.4 will probably have the variant dungeon, and then 7.5 will have... By the way, I mean the .x5 patch for all of these things, right? Besides Cosmic Exploration. And then sometime in the 7.5x window, we'll see the new zone for the Occult Crescent. I think that's what the remaining parts of Dawntrail are going to end up looking like. I hope player feedback is taken into account. I hope the execution of these various systems and endgame content pillars is shored up as a direct result. I just don't really see the large philosophical changes that I think a lot of people are wanting to see out of Final Fantasy XIV. I don't think we get those things until like 8.0 and 8.x. Speaking of 8.0, we know next to nothing. Maybe we'll get a bunch of extensive job changes. Or maybe the changes will be largely minor or continue in the direction that has disillusioned a lot of people, with job design en masse becoming way too simplistic and repetitive. Or maybe it'll go in the other direction. We don't know. What are some of the things that I personally would like to see out of the next expansion for Final Fantasy XIV? Before we get into the swing of things, when we get into FanFest season and all that, and we start to get actual information. I would like to see a revision on the dungeon system. I would like to see dungeons being way less formulaic. I would like to see some non-linearity there. We don't need to make these things tough as nails or anything like that, but I think dungeons need a mechanical shakeup. They shouldn't just be so cookie cutter. So what if one dungeon is shorter compared to another dungeon? Allow there to be variety. Min-maxing is an unfortunate effect of modern gaming, but when game design itself is min-maxed, it can leave things feeling soulless and just pretty much like slop shoveled out the door. Oh look, it's another Final Fantasy XIV dungeon. It's cool the first time, it loses all of its charm and appeal the second time, and the third time, and especially the fourth time. I would like to see content like Cosmic Exploration and the Occult Crescent again in the future. However, I would like them to really not play it safe when it comes to the elements of the gameplay design in those features. I would love to see an expansion or another iteration of the Phantom Job system, because the mechanics of the individual Phantom Jobs weren't particularly appealing to me, but the system itself, in my opinion, has so much dang potential to introduce just the right amount of customization into Final Fantasy XIV. And whether or not they introduce that system to the game on the whole, or just relegate it to the next iteration of a field operation in Final Fantasy XIV or whatever, I would like to see them go balls to the wall, be wacky, be crazy with what these Phantom Jobs can and should be able to do. There's a lot of design in Final Fantasy XIV that I think is largely left to the wayside to either stagnate or largely be ignored. Fates, Leave Quests are two examples of this. Increase the rewards for both of these things. Bring Leave Quests back, first of all. Have way more variety in the objectives you do in these types of content. Flesh out the rewards for them as well. You can keep the gem system for Fates as well, by the way, but give even more rewards, give way more XP, so they can be viewed as like an alternate leveling path for alt jobs if you want that, and have there be cool little gameplay events during the Fates. Like, there are Fates that already exist where you're supposed to be defending a position. Why not have fun with it? Why not have little turrets that select people might be able to interact with, get on a turret, and perhaps lay down some covering fire? Make use of the mech system from Cosmic Exploration, and have there be like some power armor suits that players can interact with to get a few unique but powerful abilities during those specific fates and stuff like that. Why not take some of the design from content like field operations, like the Occult Crescent, and bake that stuff into the actual zones at an end-game level to help repopulate those zones to make them feel alive and to give players more of a reason to revisit those zones after the main story has concluded for them. I think there's a lot of ways to take existing ideas that already exist in Final Fantasy XIV and to iterate on them and to flesh them out to really make them fun and engaging. I don't think the game needs to be completely remade from the ground up. You know, unless the backend just prevents them from actually having fun with this stuff and really leaning into a lot of these ideas. But like, also on top of that, I think content like the Occult Crescent and Cosmic Exploration, those types of content need to come online way early in an expansion cycle. They don't need to be there for 0.0, right? But like by 0.15, we should have at least the new field operation to some degree, or something akin to that, like what we just talked about with baking that functionality into the actual endgame zones. Get the relic grind started way earlier as well, by the way. The hype for an expansion is hottest right at its start, and the game needs to be in a position where it is able to have content that people want to do available when that hype is hottest. Capture their attention and make them want to continue playing. And I'm sure it's a lot of work, and maybe not everything that I stated here is entirely possible. My retort to that would be that I think Square Enix needs to give the team behind Final Fantasy XIV enough manpower, enough resources, and enough money to be able to have a content cadence like this. Because other games are able to do it, Final Fantasy XIV should be able to as well. They don't have to do any of the ideas that I just stated, by the way. Those are just like me spitballing things they could do. There's other ways to make this game way more interesting, and I'm sure I haven't even thought of all of them, right? I'm just saying there are ways to take the pillars of content this game has already done before, whether they actively iterate on them or not. Things like Grand Companies, things like Guild Hests and Leave Quests, things like fates, things like side quests. There are ways to take these pieces of content and to remix them in such a way to be way more fun and engaging by giving them way more variety, interesting things to do, and perhaps upping the difficulty just a bit. We don't need to make it savage rating even, or even extreme trial worthy, but it needs to be content that isn't brain dead easy to do, and it needs to fill out that difficulty gap between instance rating and open world activities, because that gap in terms of what the game asks you to do is massive. There needs to be content that fills that gap. You don't need to make everything in the game even remotely challenging. You can have the turbo easy stuff as well, but you can't make a bunch of content particularly fun and interesting and engaging for a lot of people if they don't ask you to really do anything, because they design it for the lowest common denominator all the time, unless you're in a raid instance. We need more middle ground stuff. I think they can do it, and I'll be interested to see what they do when the time comes. But leave a comment down below with what you would like to see them do with a piece of content in Final Fantasy XIV. What would you like to see them do with, say, dungeons or fates, or pick whatever you want? I'd love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions and hear your perspectives. And while you're down there, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Follow me on TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter, Jmulls G. And if you want to hear what other members of my community had to say about Final Fantasy XIV and their own hot takes, you should check out this video right here for more. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again!